Welcome to the first of our two forums co-sponsored by Queen Anne Lutheran Church in Seattle and St. Luke's Lutheran Church in Bellevue. I'm Dan Peterson, pastor of Queen Anne Lutheran, and I am delighted to see all of you here. Welcome. I hand it over to Pastor Mark Griffith, who will introduce our speaker. Thanks again for being here.
I'm Pastor Mark Griffith. I'm the pastor at St. Luke's Lutheran Church. Welcome to all of you. It's great to see all of these familiar faces in this forum. Pastor Dan and I are thrilled to be able to partner together and provide this for you. I was first introduced to Dr. WIlliams' work a few years ago at Pacific Lutheran University when he gave a talk around his book, Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus, and I was absolutely blown away. Here was a scholar, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, that I attribute his work was so influential on me that even was a part of my story of how I ended up becoming a pastor myself and going to seminary. And I was amazed and shocked and a little ashamed that I didn't know that about Bonhoeffer's life. It was exciting, exhilarating to hear Dr. WIlliams' presentation, and really opened a whole new way of thinking about Bonhoeffer. And the experience that Bonhoeffer had in the Black church and how his experience with persons of color really transformed him. And I was really grateful to have that presentation and really grateful to hear his work and really excited about that. So that was my personal experience with you in that room, and it was really profound for me. So I really appreciate your time at that moment and that you're able to be with us now. Now, just for protocol, I think here's the formal academic introduction. Dr. WIlliams, and this is just right off the McCormick website, Dr. WIlliams' research interests include Christological ethics, theological anthropology, Christian social ethics, the Harlem Renaissance, race, politics, and Black church life. His current book projects include a religious critique of whiteness in the Harlem Renaissance. In addition, he is working on a book analyzing the reception of Bonhoeffer by liberation activists in apartheid South Africa. Dr. WIlliams received his PhD in Christian ethics at Fuller Theological Seminary in 2011. He earned a master's degree in theology from Fuller in 2006 and a bachelor's degree in religious studies from Westmont College in 1995. He is a member of the board of directors for the Society of Christian Ethics, as well as the International Dietrich Bonhoeffer Society. He is also a member of the American Academy of Religion and the Society for the Study of Black Religion. Welcome, Dr. WIlliams. We're really grateful that you're with us and look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Pastor Mark and Pastor Dan, for your invitation. This was the catalyst for me. How does our understanding of Jesus influence our morality? And I didn't know how I was going to address that. And then I came across this story. My mentor, the man who trained me in Christian ethics, Glenn Stassen, he says he trained a number of Bonhoeffer scholars. Glenn did. Passed away in 2014, just the year that my book was being published, 78. But for Glenn, the time that Bonhoeffer spent in New York was really a catalyst for this transformation that allowed him to see before anybody else that the Nazis were evil. And the majority of Christians in Germany went right along with Hitler and the Nazis. And in fact, the Nazis would not have gained the power that they did without Christian support. They couldn't have. Yet this 25-year-old genius, whippersnapper, wet behind the ears, ruddy, yet somewhat arrogant young man, trained by all of these professors, and that he ends up working alongside at the University of Berlin, was pushing back against them very early, very radically, thinking that he was going to a concentration camp as early as age 27. Dachau was opened in 1933. So how did he gain this insight? He wasn't the only one, but he was very vocal and he wrote a lot. How did he gain this insight? Glenn said it's from time spent in a Black Baptist church in Harlem. Glenn was extremely Baptist, the most Baptist man I ever met. So he's very proud of his Baptist roots. So he says it's Abyssinian Baptist. I taught a course with him on Bonhoeffer while I was his doctoral student, and I also happened to recognize that that time corresponded with the Harlem Renaissance. I had done a project when I was a master's student, and in a class on theology and art. And at the end of that class, I studied a painter of the Harlem Renaissance, Aaron Douglas, one of the most prominent artists in the Harlem Renaissance. And come to find out that when Dietrich Bonhoeffer is in New York, it's corresponding with this movement. I'll say more about what the Harlem Renaissance is, for those of you who may be unfamiliar with that movement. But it's a hugely important time in Black history, happening right there in New York. And artists and intellectuals from the Harlem Renaissance are in and out of Abyssinian Baptist Church, where Bonhoeffer is a lay leader. All of that time there is hugely influential. When I went to comb through stuff that Bonhoeffer brought back with him to Germany from New York, I found a lot of information that he kept. A lot of, paperwork, bibliographies, all of this stuff related to the struggle against white supremacy for Black people that were important to him, important enough to keep. And his bibliography from the the Harlem branch of the New York Library had a coffee stain on it. I guess he spilled some coffee while he was lingering over this thing, finding out what to read next. But anyway, that said, let me jump right into this because I don't want to linger too long. What I'm going to share with you now is a little bit of an overview from this text that I wrote and some of the research that I got. It's focusing primarily on Abyssinian Baptist and the Harlem Renaissance through one key figure of the Harlem Renaissance, a young poet named Countee Cullen, this poem that Bonhoeffer mentions by name. So let's begin here. So first of all, to know about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he was one of 8 children. There were 4 boys and 4 girls. Bonhoeffer was the youngest of the 4 boys, and he had a twin, his sister Sabine. He was born just a few minutes before her, fraternal twin. They were very wealthy. They were an academic family. Dad was in charge of the Charité Hospital, which was a psychiatric hospital connected to the University of Berlin, in Berlin. They had servants, and the kids were the older 5 were homeschooled, and the younger 3, they had a homeschooling interrupted when mom sent them to school when they moved into a neighborhood in Berlin that was associated with a lot of other different professors from the University of Berlin. And Bonhoeffer's family were not church-going. In fact, mom was the only one who had leanings, who was Christian. She did Bible study with the family, with the children at home. Dad was agnostic. The other brothers were not Christians, and neither were the sisters. So it's a very unusual thing for a theologian, especially of this nature, this stature, to come from a family that wasn't church-going. But everybody was baptized in church because that's just what you do. It's part of the culture. You get baptized, you have weddings and so forth. But Dietrich took that a bit deeper, and by the time he was age 13, he declared to his family that he wanted to be a theologian, this precocious kid. That, by way of background, is his entry into the academy. And he is 24 years old when he's completed what is essentially 2 dissertations and achieved a teaching position at the University of Berlin. 24, okay. 2 dissertations. But he was too young to be ordained in the Lutheran Church. You had to be 25 for that. So the man in charge of his ordination process recommended that he see the world a little bit. He's pretty young. See the world a bit. England was considered because he wanted to learn English better. They settled on the United States and particularly New York. Not because of the quality of the school, but because New York presented itself as a broader school ground for Bonhoeffer. He wanted to learn theology, he says, as it is developed in circumstances completely different from our own. So he was already planning on being in Harlem by the time he got there. So spring 1931 was the second semester of Bonhoeffer's Sloan Fellowship year at Union. The Sloan Fellowship was a fellowship, a scholarship presented to three European students. There was a French Sloan Fellow, there was a Swiss Sloan Fellow, and there was a German Sloan Fellow. Bonhoeffer obviously was the German one. The Sloan Fellowship recipients would typically come, get the equivalent of a Master of Divinity, which was at that time as a BD, Bachelor of Divinity, and then head back to their home country. The German Sloan Fellowship had 2 dissertations completed by the time he got there. He was not excited about being there trying to learn theology from people who he would really be his colleagues if they were good enough in his mind. So it was, but the spring 1931 was the second semester of his Sloan Fellowship year at Union. With the arrival of the spring, the influential stay in America for the 25-year-old genius from Berlin was nearing its final months. Miles Horton was a friend and fellow student with Bonhoeffer that year, who later recalled an uncharacteristic encounter with Bonhoeffer in the lobby of the seminary on Sunday afternoon in that spring semester. Horton saw Bonhoeffer as he was returning to the seminary from Abyssinian Baptist, this prominent Black Baptist church in Harlem, not more than 45 minutes walk from Union Seminary. Bonhoeffer was a lay leader there, where he and his friend Albert Franklin Fisher, one in a small number of African American students at Union that year, and indeed I think there was only 2. They taught a Sunday school class to a group of boys. Miles Horton, noticed that Bonhoeffer was lingering in the lobby, and to Horton's surprise, he was quite emotional, Bonhoeffer was, which was out of character for his typically logical and unemotive temperament. He was excited to talk that day about church. Horton remembered Bonhoeffer referring to the Black church as the only time he had experienced religion in the United States. In that conversation, Bonhoeffer said that he was convinced that it was only among Blacks who were oppressed that there could be any real religion in this country. As Horton reflected on this encounter with Bonhoeffer years later, he said, perhaps that Sunday afternoon, I witnessed a beginning of his identification with the oppressed, which played a role in the decision that led to his death. Now, I would encourage, if you have the opportunity to do so, that you pick up an article I wrote for Christian Century, if you've not already, if you don't get the Christian Century. I wrote an article that was published on the cover of the September 23rd edition. In that article, I wrote that article in the week that George Floyd was murdered, and I did that to offer definition of terms that we use when we talk about racism. Racism and white supremacy are interchangeable. I use them interchangeably because they're both describing the same phenomenon. But it clarifies terms and describes what is happening in the world here, and why racism, white supremacy are not prejudice, and why prejudice is not xenophobia. When he's in Harlem, he encounters white supremacy as understood from the perspective of Black people. This is one of the things that's very helpful and important for him. Yet he struggles with it for the entirety of his life, in himself as well. So I just wanted to say that, because as he encounters that Black Baptist church, he encounters a worldview that helps to set him on a trajectory against his government. The year following that conversation at Union with Bonhoeffer, Miles Horton, together with his friend Jim Dombrowski, also a friend of Bonhoeffer's at Union, went on to found the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee as a place for training in social justice work. People like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Ralph Abernathy, and other significant figures of the civil rights movement received training at Highlander. Like Horton and Dombrowski, Bonhoeffer was influenced by encounters with African Americans, which helped place him on a trajectory that saw solidarity and suffering with suffering and oppressed people as core Christian leadership. Yet Bonhoeffer was not always so excited about his stay in New York. In fact, when he first got there, he didn't have a whole lot of positive things to say. But in his end of the year church summary to the Federation office, he described a course that he took with Reinhold Niebuhr that I think is telling. He says that in a lecture course by Dr. Niebuhr, once described as the country's best theologian, Reinhold Niebuhr was, if you don't know that name. In a lecture course by Niebuhr, the social and Christian problem was discussed in the context of modern American literature. That was extremely informative. I learned much from my own experiences in Harlem, Bonhoeffer says. So he speaks positively about the course with Niebuhr. Dombrowski talks about him being excited. These are both experiences in the second semester. First semester, when he first gets there, he's not excited at all. In fact, for Bonhoeffer, there is no theology here. This is his first semester. Although I'm basically taking classes and lectures in dogmatics and philosophy of religion, the impression is overwhelmingly negative. They talk a blue streak without the slightest substantive foundation, with no evidence of any criteria. The students, on average 25 to 30 years old, are completely clueless. This guy coming from Germany is feeling himself a bit, and he's not excited about where he's at. Yet in that spring semester, he's talking about learning from Harlem, and he's excited about that church. What happened? What is this learning that he's doing in Harlem? I'm saying that difference corresponds with a developing appreciation for social justice as a core component of following Christ. It's a difference that was influenced by Harlem, experiences that he describes with Miles Horton that apprehended him in an uncharacteristically passionate way. Bonhoeffer's positive description of several spring semester courses, including Niebuhr's class, his encounter with Horton, they may tell us something of the personal significance of that year in New York from him and his subsequent Christian witness. What was this learning he was referring to in Harlem? We may begin to discern an answer to that by paying attention to what was happening in Harlem at that time. He was studying at Union during the Harlem Renaissance at Abyssinian Baptist, during the Great Depression. That means that all of his descriptions of his involvement in African American life, 1930-31, was occurring during this critical moment in world history and Black history. He also turned 25 during that year, in February of that year. Thus, in addition to that time and place being very influential in the course of Black history, Bonhoeffer was in Harlem experiencing that critical time while he was still young and impressionable. In New York, that Renaissance consisted of an effort to introduce, the Harlem Renaissance did, introduce the world to a new Negro. Now, what does this mean? The new Negro was something very different than the old Negro. And the old Negro, we might say, is caricatures of Black people created by white people to justify buying and selling Black people and subsequent practices of Jim Crow segregation. These are depictions of Black people that do not come from actual Black life. The Harlem Renaissance, as this slide depicts here, this is a painting from Aaron Douglas, the artist I told you I studied. This is one of 4 paintings that are in the Harlem branch of the New York Library, hanging there as in what he describes as this homage to Black life, the Negro, from slavery to freedom. Here in the far left-hand corner, a figure is depicted in the grips of deadly white supremacy, depicted as a phantom and deadly vapors. It's the death grips are about to grasp him, or he is in the death grips. It's death dealing. Over here on the right, he's fleeing those death grips on a cogwheel, symbol of industry. This is during industrialization. They're going up north for jobs. In the South, there were sharecropping and debt peonage. If you don't know, sharecropping is what happens after slavery when you've got acres and acres of land owned by people who don't know how to work it because they've had enslaved people working it. They own land, but no skills, farming skills. Then you had skilled labor with no property. They worked out an agreement, or at least white people made an agreement with the free labor. You can work our property, you can rent the equipment and borrow the seeds and the fertilizer, all the stuff for farming. And when the crop comes due, you just pay us what you owe us, which is basically a harvest. There were no laws in the South that white people were bound to respect when it comes to Black life. So Black people were subject to the benevolence of the white landowners, and they were somehow often short, somehow often regularly, I should say, somehow regularly short during the harvest. And so what this created was this sense, was really another page, another chapter in the story of slavery, poverty for these sharecroppers constantly. World War I hits 1914, Black people are enabled to leave and go work in these factories because people who would normally work the factories are immigrants, and they're staying at home fighting in the war or being pulled into the war. So the Great Migration here is depicted as a move up north on the industrial cogwheel. And then they make it to the north here, and this saxophone is an image of culture and freedom, the hands raised. And in the distance is the Statue of Liberty depicting the way that this is moving or where this is going. So that's the Harlem Renaissance. And I'm running out of time here. Let me move a little faster. So Bonhoeffer he's in Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance, but there's something else that's important to know. By the time that Bonhoeffer gets there, these 2 dissertations, really a doctoral dissertation and what the Germans call a habilitation, are all engaging this, what he would call a Christian concept of personhood, which is foundational for his understanding of, for his doctrine of the church, and which is, even that is centrally located on an understanding of Jesus. So he's really known for what he described as Christ as Stellvertretung, Christ as vicarious representation for humanity. In short, when we in our sin and shame cannot stand before God, Christ stands in for us, becoming vicarious representation for all of humankind. And it's not in a spiritual sense, primarily spiritual sense. This is literal for Bonhoeffer. Christ stands in for us before God and before us as well in all of our neighborly encounters, because Christ is our stand-in Every time you meet a person, you have an encounter with Christ. In a very real sense. Christ is that the ultimate you when you encounter another. And there are many reasons, many implications for this. But when he heads into Harlem, having these encounters with others, he plays a role of learner, not teacher. He's encountering the world from their experience, entering into that context, listening, as well as teaching Sunday school for boys and teaching Bible study in a midweek class to women at the church, standing in. And he's hearing things like this from Powell. Powell Sr., driving his very nice car down what is now Lenox Avenue in Harlem during the Great Depression, looks out of his window and he sees Black people suffering. As the saying goes, there's an adage in African Americans say that when white America gets a cold, Black America gets pneumonia. We feel it much more so. And he's seeing all of the suffering. And he says, God, why don't you do something? And a couple of days later, he says he's asleep. And as he's sleeping, he hears, Adam, why don't you do something? Takes this as a charge to do something about it. And as any good pastor would do, he preaches a sermon series in response to the call to get busy doing something. And this sermon in the sermon series is based on Matthew 25. I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. Thirsty, you gave me something to drink. One sermon is called The Hungry God, the other one is Naked God. This is a clip from The Hungry God. We clothe God by clothing men and women. Jesus interpreted this as a command to clothe men and women when they are naked. When you give men and women coats, shoes, and dresses, you're giving clothes to God. If the Bible does not mean this, it does not mean anything. I'll stop there. The rest of it you can see if you've not already read it. What I've said about Stellvertretung may sound familiar when you're hearing this clip from Powell, that your encounter with your neighbor is an encounter with the incarnate God. Bonhoeffer is hearing this kind of language there at Abyssinian Baptist. And he is teaching there and attending on a regular basis. Yet Christianity at Abyssinian did more than just address the problems of poverty. Christianity at Abyssinian was representation of a God in Christ who suffers with us, not one who's risen with all power, not one who meets your faith and makes your life perfect, but one who recognizes the suffering and is liberator and is deliverer in addition to, initially as co-sufferer. Christ is there with you on the cross. The connection made to Christ is connection in suffering, not in power. That's a very important distinction. Yet he's also encountering the Harlem Renaissance. So he's encountering this Christ at Abyssinian that's reflected in the work of the Harlem Renaissance, because the Harlem Renaissance artists and intellectuals are depicting this kind of engagement with Christ. What is this Christ that they're depicting? Well, if Black people are caricatured as immoral, the old Negro was immoral, lazy, violent, dumb, somehow deserving of the situation that they are in when they're in the noose. So the lynch law was what Blacks were leaving from the South. Why Blacks were leaving from the South is really refugees from terror, in addition to poverty. The depictions of Black people made sense in a white racist world for that suffering. The same that happens on a regular basis today. After a Black person is murdered, there is something drudged up about the past or about their being to correspond with, or actually to give reason to what your eyes have witnessed. This is fiction about Black life to justify their horrible existence. But if the connection that Black people make with Christ is in suffering, and Black people on the cross with Christ, it's the corresponding knowledge that we know of Jesus on that cross that gives us this understanding of Black suffering. Innocent, important, child of God. This is the Black person on the cross. This is Black Christ. And Bonhoeffer is looking at society from this perspective. He talks about the veiled corner, using language that Du Bois makes mention of. And I have this quote here from Du Bois, so you'll understand when the language of the veil is an image that Du Bois is using. I've seen the human drama from a veiled corner, where all the outer tragedy and comedy have reproduced themselves in a microcosm from within. From this inner torment of souls, the human scene without has interpreted itself to me in unusual and even illuminating ways. The veiled corner. This is the perspective that Black people have on a society where they exist but are not welcomed within, not part of. Okay. Bonhoeffer says this in a letter at the end. Letter home. Here one gets to see something of the real face of America, something that is hidden behind the veil of words in the American Constitution saying that all men are created equal. These are Bonhoeffer's words. I think I'm going a little bit over my time. I've gone over my time already. I wanted to close up by then, but let me just say here that he's also, this is all evidence of what he's hearing. He's talking about Black life there. These are his words, talking about the distinction between two Black leaders, prominent Black leaders, an argument that he's aware of that's speaking of Black renewal of Black self. And then he mentions this poem by name, Countee Cullen's The Black Christ, a fascinating poem about a lynching. And in this poem, there's a pious Black woman, pious Black mother. She's got two sons. The youngest ends up being lynched. And the oldest, who is in a role, functions in a role like Job's accusers, angry at mom, who is still holding to her faith while her son is being lynched. We have that narrative about us today, Black mothers constantly losing their children to white supremacy. And this mom kneels and prays, and the older son, seeing his mother in prayer, call on him now, I mocked, and try your faith against this deed, while I, with intent equally as sane, searching a motive for this pain, will hold a little stone on high and seek of it a reason why. Which stone or God will first reply? What has he done for you who spent a bleeding life for his content? Or is white Christ too also distraught by these dark skins his father wrought? White Christ, is he not also upset or distraught by the Black people that his dad has made? The next morning, the son who was lynched walks back through the front door, and he recognizes, oh my gosh, he's not with the lynchers, he's with us. O form immaculately born, betrayed 1,000 times each morn, as many times each night denied, surrendered, tortured, crucified. This is the poem that he's talking about. Black Christ, identifying with that family and suffering. He mentions it by name, Bonhoeffer does. Later, in 1939, when he does a full-on essay on Christianity in the United States called Protestantism Without Reformation, after a second trip that only lasted a few weeks. So all of that to say, when he, this is that poem, when he gets back to Germany, it's this kind of content that shapes his understanding of Christianity. He goes from having developed a concept as a theologian, really in his 2 dissertations, to being concerned about discipleship and taking his faith seriously and pushing back against white supremacy. Yet he struggles with this for the rest of his life, even internally. I'll stop there and we can have further conversation. I should probably describe to you this painting that you're seeing. This is Aaron Douglas again. This is the description, or I should say the understanding of Christ that Bonhoeffer picks up on. Aaron Douglas is painting the Crucifixion. Now, let me say this. When I ask this question, people are drawn into what's happening. They're wondering what's happening here. But I say, where is Jesus? It's typical that you might think, you may think, yeah, it's a cross, it's a guy carrying a cross, right? Jesus crucified, but no, that's not Jesus. Here at the 5th station of the cross, when Jesus could not carry the cross any longer, Simon from Cyrene, North Africa, Black people. I grew up knowing this tradition, that when Christ could no longer carry the cross, and this is Christ here. When Christ could no longer carry the cross, Simon carried the cross for him. When Simon's black body touched that black cross with Christ, Black people picked up the suffering. I knew this growing up. Now, what does it say about the people who nailed Jesus to the cross? What does it say about the people who are I should say, that's not the question I meant to ask. The question I meant to ask is, what does this say about the people who contribute to or cause Black suffering with this understanding of Black suffering? And that's the point. Now I'll stop and let's talk. That was about 10 minutes longer than I anticipated. Right. Apologies.
No, that's just fine. Thanks for that. That was fantastic.
So thank you for both writing a powerful book and a really powerful presentation. I have a number of questions. We spoke before the presentation about what inspired you to write the book, and I'm also curious about the reaction you got to the book or continue to get to the book. But before I get even to those questions and before I get even to the content of the book itself, I was wondering if you could say a few words about the title and why you chose Black Jesus rather than Black Christ, if there's any significance there.
Funny story about that title. I actually didn't like the title initially when the publisher proposed it. He's a bit like, if you know the world of college basketball, Bobby Knight, who coached at Indiana and was really, really, really loud and kind of having his way and so forth. Well, my publisher was like the Bobby Knight of publishing. And he demanded that he gets to give the book a title. It was in my contract. When he proposed the title, if you know the Black theologian James Cone, who was a friend of mine, somebody that I had a great deal of respect for, a mentor from a distance. I said, what do you think, Dr. Cone, of this book? Because Cone liked Bonhoeffer a lot too. And he was really skeptical about it. My mentor loved the title. Glenn did. He said, you're not saying that he had the Black Christ. You're saying he had a Black Christ. Okay, so there's that. And the title grew on me. It had to grow on me. Initially, I wanted to say Black Bonhoeffer. I wanted to call it Black Bonhoeffer. I wanted to describe a blackening that happened for him because of a transition in his way of seeing the world and his Christianity. But I didn't have a chance against that Bobby Knight publisher. So Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus Jackie Grant is a black woman theological ethicist who makes a distinction between white women's Christ, which we might say is a formal, doctrinal-based, high church, less day-to-day concrete encounter with others focused, less of a at a guttural level worship of Christ, worship of Jesus, than a black woman's Jesus. The title of her book is called White Woman's Christ, Black Woman's Jesus. Okay. To say Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus is to speak to the day-to-day encounter with Jesus of black people. Not in a formal sense, but in a very informal sense of he knows me.
Jesus then being the more familiar,
Yeah.
intimate term, and Christ being more of a separate or kind of abstract concept.
Yeah. Formal
Wow.
religion versus family.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Versus, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Familial.
Right.
And Black Jesus, as familial in a black world.
Mm-hmm.
Suffering is the point of contact that black people make with Jesus, not in the halls of power, as if to say, you don't know him if you think he was born in Caesar's house.
Uh-huh.
Because he's with us, as Howard Thurman says, if Jesus was pushed into a ditch by the Romans because he was a poor Jew in a colonized state, he would have just been another Jew in a ditch. Much the same way that black people lynched is just another black person, and they don't use the word black person, in a noose or in a ditch. That's Jesus.
Oh. Is that the perspective of the veiled corner? Is that what people outside the veil can't see?
Yes, people carrying on their day-to-day don't have the view from the balcony.
Uh-huh.
They can't see the web of systems and structures that they inhabit on a daily basis.
Yeah.
That are all woven together by an ideology that keeps me an insider outsider. Because I'm a part of the country, but I'm an outsider to the country as well. I should say this is an important perspective to have. One of the things about white supremacy as a Western world understanding of human difference, this is helpful to know about how the Germans practiced white supremacy that is a part of our understanding of it as well. They had colonies in Africa, much the same. The United States only had one colony, Liberia. It was colonized. We don't talk about it in that way. But the Germans had several colonies. And when it came to Hitler's Germany, there weren't a whole lot of black people in Germany. But the black people were there. They were somewhat comfortable with pure blood black people from Africa, especially if they're from the colonies, because that depicted German power. And they were not claiming citizenship. They weren't claiming this is our space. But Jewish people were. Jewish people had citizenship. They had claims on the space that belonged to the Aryan. Therefore, they were a threat. But black people, few in numbers, pure blood from the colonies, represented German strength, might, and power. The same thing here in the United States. Whose land and country is this? If you make protest about your treatment here and demand co-humanity, co-citizenship, that tends to be a problem. wear that lapel pin and don't complain or get out.
Wow.
Or go home. Yeah, we hear that rhetoric
Go
politically.
home. Get out
Yeah.
of here.
Yeah. Love it or leave it.
The same sentiment.
Mhm.
But if I am white, protest all you want. Of course, demand your rights and your citizenry. Wear a lapel pin or not, put your hand over your heart or not, whatever. It's the practice is of domination and know your place, be grateful, or get out.
And that perspective of the veiled corner in Harlem significantly transformed how Bonhoeffer thought about the Jewish community in Germany. Is that, you'd make that connection?
Yeah, I would make that connection. I certainly would. Right when he gets back in 1931, he writes a catechism with a Jewish friend, Franz Hildebrand. In his catechism, you see it immediately. Before he leaves, he gives this sermon. He gave a set of sermons to an expatriate congregation of Germans in Barcelona, Spain, where he was pastoring before he came back to write his second dissertation. One of those sermons, he's talking about how war could be sanctified, murder can be justified for the sake of my people. Okay, that's one thing. In that catechism, right away when he gets back, he says the Christian only prays to God for peace, not war. Huge. That's a very different tone, Dietrich.
Yeah, so
that's
something
a very
significant
different tone.
happened, right? Yeah, that's huge.
Something significant happened. Right away, he says, you do not pray for war, and there is no way to justify it. Christians must pursue peace only. And the second thing he says is that God has made from one blood all the nations that dwell on the earth. That's that's scripture that abolitionists used, and Du Bois was using it, much like the Lambs of the Veiled Corner. So, and other writers of the Harlem Renaissance. The other thing he says is that even though, and I'm paraphrasing, Christians may be uncomfortable with politics, engaging politically, there may come a time when Christians must act politically for the sake of loving your neighbor. Must engage the political structures for the sake of your neighbor.
Yeah.
That is not German.
And is that the spoke in the wheel language?
You know exactly where that's going. So this is 1931. Yeah. By 1933, in that essay, The Church and the Jewish Question, he's making that exact claim.
Yeah.
Must seize the wheel of the political system, specifically for justice sake. Yeah, that's spoken the wheel.
Yeah.
Or the actual phrasing is the church should throw itself into the spokes of the wheel. Fall into the spokes of the wheel. Yeah.
But somehow be a disruptive agent in a political process that's already on this trajectory.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because of what it's doing to and direct harm of its citizens on one hand, or not doing enough of and helping to stop harm against its citizens. In both situations, go ahead.
Oh, and that strikes me as a very pastoral response, not necessarily an academic theological response. And so it sounds like in Harlem, Bonhoeffer learned to be a theologian in a very pastoral context, in the care for the community and the harm that's being inflicted on neighbors.
Yes. There was a situation that happened while he was there that garnered international publicity. And that's the situation of the Scottsboro 9. Scottsboro boys. It was hugely important for him. It was big in the country at that time, and a big topic there in Harlem, where these boys really were hitchhiking on a train in Alabama. And they became accused. It turned to frustration over them hitchhiking to accusations of raping a white woman.
Whoa, can you hear me?
Yeah, we're back. You got you.
Yeah.
I don't know why my headphones just turned off, but they got arrested and accused of rape and they were rushed through trial, hastily convicted. Can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. And it was a clear sham. Bonhoeffer wrote back to Germany asking for his church to also raise their voice in protest, and they said that's a political issue. We don't get engaged in that. It's not the office. And he was still writing about that in the book that he was so concerned about that book that was published after he was dead, after he was killed, Ethics.
Ethics, yeah.
Yeah. He mentioned it in there. It was still on his mind.
Yeah.
And that wasn't the last time a pastor's been accused of being too political for the church.
Yeah, no, it sure wasn't.
We are at the 10 o'clock hour, so I want to formally end our conversation here by thanking Dr. Williams for today's presentation and inviting all of you to come back for our next time with Dr. Williams, where it will be all your questions for the conversation. If you'd like to linger, you're certainly welcome to. I know I'll stay for a bit, as will Pastor Mark, and hopefully Dr. Williams can stay for a bit as well. But again, thank you all for being here, and thank you to Dr. Williams for today's presentation.
And thank you, Dr. Williams, for that. Yeah, very much. Before you leave, I put in I just sent it to Dan, Pastor Dan, privately here. Let me send it to everyone. The link that Dr. Williams referred to, the Christian Century article, so you have that. The other thing that I'm going to do is, in the interim for the St. Luke's folks and maybe for the Queen Anne folks, is we'll put together some readings so you can engage some of the material more rigorously for the next time. That will help you prepare questions and maybe more thoughts for that conversation next week. So does that sound okay for everybody?
I'm going to also add my website in here.
Oh, great.
For more of that kind of information.
So in the lingering, I guess I've got a question, if I may, just lingering here. What surprised you about your study of this particular topic?
The first surprise was that nobody had made mention of it. In all of the years since Bonhoeffer was killed and then subsequently introduced to the world, that there wasn't any significant interaction with this. I was really surprised by that. I wanted to know, when I began looking in this direction, whether or not Harlem had an influence on him. And come to find out, there's enough for a book. There's enough for a whole book. And even more than that. I mean, I'm working on another manuscript on this content now. It would be, I see the question about the poem. It's a kind of a longish poem. It's called The Black Christ by Countee Cullen, so you can find it online too. So here's some of the surprise, okay. Bonhoeffer's Germany is overtly racist. Okay. No one questions that. In fact, the term racism comes into common usage after Nazi Germany to describe the way that the Germans treated the Jews. The historian, really wonderful historian of racism, George Fredrickson, in his book, Racism, A Short History, makes this claim. Okay. It's overtly racist. The Aryan is a racial figure. They have a study called raceology, which is akin to what eugenics is here in the United States. Okay, wow. All of this is profoundly embedded within the way the country is working. Yet, the study of Dietrich Bonhoeffer in the United States, and in particular, especially the West English-speaking world, doesn't address that. Doesn't address specifically the way Dietrich Bonhoeffer is dealing with a racist state. Why not?
Interesting.
Be fascinating to do a study on Dietrich Bonhoeffer and racism. I promise you, if you do that on Google, you'll probably just see pictures of me. Just pictures of me, an interaction with me. And my dissertation was finished in 2011. Okay, he was murdered in 1945.
Yeah.
Okay,
Wow.
and then there's a Bonhoeffer Society that comes online in the 1970s. Okay, that's the decade I was born. Roughly, I was probably about 3 years old when this thing comes up, is put in place. And in all of these years, that's left untouched. Now, I come along as a black person, a black theological ethicist. Okay, for me as a theological ethicist, which is different than a intellectual historian. For me, the concern is the way in which we live in relationship to each other and how that's influenced by our core convictions, our faith. How does that faith guide the way we understand what it means to live a moral life and human flourishing? So this is in our day-to-day social interaction, the kind of formation that the gospel the influence for formation that the gospel has on our being and the way this being behaves in the world. Okay, that's theological ethics. Social ethics has to do with the way that is engaging issues in society. Okay, racism being one of those things. Economics, ecology, sexism, and all these kinds of things. Okay. Bonhoeffer is an ethicist in the context of an overtly racist state, a theological ethicist in the context of an overtly racist state. Now let me back up. He's a theologian, clearly concerned with whether or not the church makes any commands or may say anything that is imperative for the believer to do. That is ethics. Okay, that's ethics. He's doing all of this in the context of a nation state that's building a community for the Aryan. Why hasn't anybody addressed this?
Yeah.
And that is where that's in response to your question. That was the most surprising thing for me.
Yeah. But that was the first I'd heard of it when you gave that presentation at PLU, and my mind was just blown. I mean, I couldn't believe I didn't know that about Bonhoeffer, and then I couldn't believe the debt of gratitude I feel like we owe to the Black community in Harlem, because I think without that experience, we certainly wouldn't have the Bonhoeffer we know today.
Mm.
Can you say a word, given the unique character of your book, sadly, after all these years, can you say a word about the kind of reception that you've received and what surprised you, if anything, in the reception?
I had no idea that it would be as important or as helpful or as interesting as it was. I had no clue. Honestly, after spending so much time working on a text like that, after spending so much time working on a text, an author just hopes, I mean, it's the equivalent of, I hope people don't think my baby's ugly. But it heads off, it's born, it comes into the world, and wow, within 3 weeks, it's into a second printing.
Wow.
And my gosh, and then I'm puzzled, why is it so sought after? It's here now about 6 years old, this month, 6 years old. And it's still being very widely read. It's still very popular. And I'm trying to wrap my mind around why that is so, that is still the case. And I'm wrestling with whether or not how we should look at that time to say I mean, I thought that was an interesting thing, Mark. We owe Harlem a debt of gratitude for. I would say maybe Bonhoeffer owes Harlem a debt of gratitude for opening his eyes.
Absolutely, yeah.
The struggle that Black people encounter in a white racist world is ongoing, and whether or not he fully got it while he was there is up for grabs. What it did for him was push him in a direction that allowed him to see white supremacy as a Christian problem. Now, how we understand white supremacy is really important. And I would say that he still wrestled with understanding what it was. He knew that to exclude and to kill people who are racialized as other and inferior was a Christian problem. You might say that he understood the problem in the doing of life together. Okay, that racism is a matter of the way we see others and treat them. What he missed was the way it had shaped him in his understanding of himself as a white man. He missed that racism is about our being, not just our doing.
Interesting.
So you can, as a white racist, can say, I need to treat people nicer. Still believe that they need civilization and culture and morals and our intelligence. Go ahead.
The St. Luke's community, the St. Luke's group, the Adult Forum, we've been wrestling with Ibram Kendi's work and found that to be incredibly informative in kind of the overt racism category, the assimilation category. If they would just be like us, then they can be successful. And that's been really amazing to think about the culture of white supremacy and helping breaking down some of those pieces that you're, and defining white culture and just in those ways.
Sure. He and I will differ a bit on our understanding of white supremacy.
Okay.
We'll differ a bit on our understanding of white supremacy / racism. And here's the thing. I know in Stamped from the Beginning, he offers a really rich history. Now I would say that the development of the category of race is the invention of white supremacy. The very development of that category, okay,
has that built in.
It is for that purpose. The development of the category of race is the invention of a hierarchy of beings.
It was not a taxonomical nicety. It already has a hierarchy built in.
It is all apologetic for the world, being a place for the human, and the human is white. Everybody else is a derivation of that. So we get confused when we use the word. Oftentimes, we get confused when we use the word racist. That word is thrown around as a derogatory term, like name calling. You're racist. You're racist. It's kind of like saying you're a hater. You're a bad person. Instead, we need to recognize that it is simply the default way of understanding human difference since the invention of that ideology of human difference. It's the default way of understanding it. And it is white supremacy. It's not your feelings about another person. It has nothing to do with affect. It's a miscaricature to say Black people can be racist too. It's important to recognize that, because the claims of racism are really about white supremacy. And here's a clear representation of that. The Mindi, the Yoruba, the Iwe became Negro or Black when they met Europeans. They were a tribal people whose identity was connected to their culture, their heritage, and their geography. And they entered a completely different reality when they met Europeans. They became Negroes, and their identity was placed on their skin.
Mm-hmm.
Their identity was handed to them, placed on their skin, as the world was developing white as human and normal. The Western world was developing that. So everybody is conditioned by white supremacy, which is white as normal. Everybody is conditioned by that. Everybody needs to deal with the way that whiteness, this white supremacy is whiteness. This understanding of whiteness has structured how we understand ourselves. Everybody has to deal with that. That's what the Harlem Renaissance was.
Mm-hmm.
The Harlem Renaissance is a moment in Black history where the broader Black community is articulating human being as a category that includes Black life.
Mm-hmm.
Showing the world
affirmatively, yeah.
It is shedding the caricatures in a public forum of Negro that is an identity handed to Black people. It is shedding that and showing the world Black life from the perspective of Black people. Okay, lots of different ways of doing that. So that what can be said here is that everybody can be white supremacist. Everybody can believe that ideology of human difference of white as normal. Everybody can. Much the same way as you have people like Candace Owens, who are arguing for a white as normal humanity. White as ascendant, white as normal. This is not a political statement. This is the ideology of human difference that is harmful historically.
Yeah.
Now, George Fredrickson says that ideology gave rise to 3 overtly racist regimes in the 20th century. We see it in Jim Crow, we see it in Nazi Germany, and the Aryan is a national iteration of the broader Western structure of white as human. It's a national iteration of it. And in apartheid South Africa. These are 3 overtly racist regimes speaking in that language. Now, the regimes are gone, but the ideology isn't. So build that wall. You know?
Yep. It still haunts us significantly. Yeah.
Yeah, very much so. You've got decent people on both sides. You know, proud to be white, but whiteness distorts everybody's human being. I mean, everybody's being. It distorts everybody's being. Nobody is real. Everybody's chasing an ideal, just a caricature of themselves.
Wow, yeah. I'm gonna get out of the way. I've got a million questions. I could totally dominate the time. I think. But I'm curious to hear from others if there's other lingering folks here that have questions or ideas.
It's most often the case when I talk about racism, that people may understand me as saying, when I say that racism, to say that Black people, brown people, whatever, can't be racist, is saying that there's something benevolent in the heart of a person of color that keeps them from that kind of nefarious behavior. But then you'd recognize how that is a misuse of that term racist. that again is pointing to affect, to your heart. It's not about, it misrepresents or misunderstands that we're talking about our understanding of who counts as human being. And the ideology is setting up a hegemonic community. We can all believe that the human is a white-only descriptor. That's what that's saying.
So just as like being nice to Black people isn't an anti-racist strategy, so it's true that if a Black person is mean to me, that's not an expression of reverse racism or something like that, or race where they're being racist.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Show me how that mean Black person sets up academic structures, health structures, economic structures, all political systems biologically for Blacks only. That's not how the West works. The West is built, beginning with the transatlantic slave trade, on systems and structures for whites only.
And you don't have to be a member of the KKK to perpetuate those systems. We're talking about good people, solid, friendly, nice folk, good Christian folks, perpetuating those systems of oppression and horror. Really.
Exactly. Yeah. Or just accepting them. Now, this is the thing. People typically identify racism in mean acts. Yeah. Acts of harm, or when somebody feels or experiences some harm, hurt feelings, a name call, or something along those lines. But that's typically, with white supremacy, a secondary effect of a primary thing, which is longing. The longing for whites only space. It's the longing, the belief in an ideal that causes people to lash out against those people who don't belong and brandish guns on their front lawn and point them at Black Lives Matter protesters walking through their neighborhood.
Yeah.
I guess I'm like Mark. I have a ton of questions too, but I want to make sure that any other person present has a chance to ask his or hers first.
I can still hear. I'm walking to get my power cord, so keep talking. I can hear you while I'm walking.
Any thoughts percolating in the group?
Yeah.
The thing that he said about the three regimes was Jim Crow, Nazis, and Aryanism. So he separates Aryanism from Nazism?
No, I said Nazi Germany and then apartheid South Africa.
Are there other thoughts percolating?
I just want to thank Mr. Williams for taking me down memory lane, being born and raised in New York City and also raised in Harlem, and who have frequently visited Abyssina Baptist Church under Adam Clayton Powell Jr. and also Calvin Butts, who's also a part of it now. So I just want to thank you for that history lesson, and also thank you for really making me, I just thought about warm moments with my family going to Abyssina Baptist Church with Adam Clayton Powell Jr. as a little girl. And now then as a woman, I've been there under Calvin Butts. We used to walk to that church also. And then also not too far from there, we used to be stomping at the Savoy Manor.
Okay.
So that area is very, very familiar to me. And I want to thank you, Mr. Williams, for all the input in the history and everything that you did. You touched my heart today, and I want to thank you so much for that. I'm Yvonne Stokes.
Yes, ma'am. I see your name. Thank you so much for those kind words. Yeah. Calvin Butts asked me, I have a friend who's turning that book. He was working on a project to turn the book into a documentary before COVID slowed everything down. Reverend Butts was excited, was happy to be on the documentary. And as I'm talking with him about it, about Bonhoeffer being there, he asked me to take Black pastors to Germany. It was his request, take Black pastors to Germany to study Bonhoeffer. And so I started putting something like that together at his request. So I think
Wow.
he gets a lot of people. He gets a lot of people that come through Abyssinia and wanting to know about
Yes,
Dietrich.
he does. Yes, he does. When I
Yeah.
when I visit New York, now that I'm here in Washington, I usually go and see Abyssinia. I have to go there. So I'm glad that Abyssinia Baptist Church is still standing strong.
Oh, it's strong. Oh, it's still
Yes, it
standing strong.
is.
It's doing well.
Yes.
And very traditional.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. So once again, I want to thank you. And I want to thank also my friend and Pastor Dan for even inviting me to have this opportunity to hear all of that great food you gave me this morning. Thank you again.
Oh,
And God bless you in all that you do.
God bless you. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you. I'm going to sign off now because I have another church to visit.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank
You
you.
too.
Conversation makes me think of a conversation I had on a train in Germany probably 20 years ago. Met a young man who discussed Nazism, and of course for American tourists that's kind of a no-no subject, but we talked about it anyway. And he said there were three kinds of people in Nazi Germany: the people who protested, the people who cooperated, and the people who did nothing. And he says the problem is with the people who did nothing, and we're probably in that boat here.
That's those categories. So a friend of mine named David Gushee wrote a book called Righteous Gentiles of the Holocaust. And he uses in that book, he says, using the language that you said here, I'll put it just a little differently, calls perpetrators, those are people who helped the Nazis, bystanders, those are people who watched and did nothing, and the other one is righteous Gentiles. These are people who risked their lives and sometimes gave their lives to save people. And at Yad Vashem in Israel, they have an avenue of the righteous. People like Oscar Schindler, for example. Bonhoeffer's not in the avenue of the righteous, because for many of them, it's unclear as to whether or not his advocacy was for baptized Jews or all Jews. It's for many of them, it's ambiguous. For some of them, it's ambiguous. They don't know.
Wow.
But a quick story about that, because that's a fascinating that distinction. First of all, if you do the Hitler salute in Germany, you get arrested. It's just not. They just don't talk about this, but they will keep the history in front of you. I remember I studied. I had the opportunity to study for a couple of summers in Jerusalem with some rabbinic professors at a rabbinic school, and one of the teachers, the professors, was the child of a woman who survived Auschwitz, and she said it took her a while to work up the courage to go to Germany when she was an adult, knowing that her parents had been, and in a lot of family, slaughtered through this. But she did go, and she was going down into a subway one day, and there was a sign there. People pass through every day going to work, and it said, "You are entering into this area of your own accord freely." But not too long ago, there were a number of people, our own citizens, who didn't have that ability to do that. Millions of them were killed by our government. So remember them as you move about freely. That was one thing, and she was so moved by that because it was her family that were recognizing that way. The other one, you can walk along the sidewalks in Germany today, and you are likely to run across a Stolperstein. the Stolpersteiner. Literally stones of stumbling. An artist found these, took the names and addresses of people known, killed, that were known to have been murdered in the Holocaust. Found their addresses, placed their names on a bronze brick, and put it in the sidewalk in front of the building where they once lived. So you're walking along, and there is a brick that says this place, this building, now it could be a grocery store, could be a department store, could be still a house. This place that you're walking by was once occupied by, and it lists the names, a man, a woman, a family, all of them, when they were taken and where they were killed.
Wow.
A powerful memorial to them. This is not the categories I wanted to say something else. I just ended up going in this direction. But I, as an African American, I identify as Black because the diaspora is bigger than the United States, Black diaspora. But as an African American, I've been to West Africa, where my ancestors were taken from, and we have no Stolpersteiner. And here in the United States, we really have no memorial to, other than the ones black people have put together for lynching, that would identify where my ancestors come from, or where any of my ancestors were any of their lives were taken here. So I love the Stolpersteiner. Those are really meaningful. I want to tell you the story I meant to tell you, if I can. In his book, the intro to his book, Righteous Gentiles of the Holocaust, David tells a story about a man, Simcha Rosen is his name. Simcha Rosen lives in this ghetto where Jews were all huddled. Before it was a halfway before the concentration camps became a thing, where it became the go-to for Jews. They heard that the ghetto up the way was liquidated, and they knew that they were going to be next, so they armed themselves. And when the Einsatzgruppen, these are the mobile death squads, showed up knocking on the door saying, bring out your, and they picked a category of person, because they were going to separate these people and then slaughter the rest. The Jews opened fire. They fought back. It was a surprise initially, but then shortly afterwards, the Einsatzgruppen and the mobile death squad was in the village slaughtering Jewish people. Simcha Rosen is in a building looking down, and he's seeing all of this carnage happen. Local villagers who were not part of the ghetto were also running in, and they were looting, and they were helping to kill. I mean, violent, terrible acts. Simcha sees a wooded area off in the distance, and he's thinking if he could just get through the carnage to the wooded area, he and his child that he's holding might survive. So he grabs his baby and he takes off through the village and avoids the carnage. And he runs by a local villager standing in the field between his ghetto and the woods, and he lays his child at her feet. A Christian woman. Somehow he knows Christian. She's a Christian woman. Lays his child at her feet and flees. Why? Because he knows that in that woods that he's likely to get caught. But they can't tell whether or not this child is Jewish or Christian. If he hands the baby to to this Christian woman, she has a chance of survival. But what he doesn't know is if she's a perpetrator, a bystander, or if she's willing to act on behalf of that child. If she's a bystander, she's going to leave the baby there in the field. If she's a perpetrator, she may pick that baby up and kill it. but in the book is detailing who among us would be willing to give our lives for the future of our country, for the future, well, for that child, and all the possibilities that come along with who is that child before us. So your story made me think of that. I just had to tell that story of Simcha.
I'm also a little surprised that nobody's brought up, and this I think would maybe be a question for next time, is how Eric Metaxas has influenced the conversation about Bonhoeffer.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's my question too.
Oh,
And
yeah.
how he reflects the kind of broader cultural appropriation of Bonhoeffer to, in many ways, justify the very things that Bonhoeffer was against.
Yeah, it's pretty gross.
Yeah,
I think that'd be a rich, maybe a question to explore in the next section. To think about maybe, yeah.
Just in short, and we do this often, people do this often with people who are no longer with us, deceased figures from the past who can't speak up, who can't say anything, they can't speak for themselves. You embody them like an avatar, make them move around according to your tastes or likes. But it's a gross caricature. He turns Bonhoeffer really into an agent of the state, of the totalitarian state, a conservative founder of the Tea Party movement. It's a misrepresentation. And he went after the Bonhoeffer Guild as well when we put out a statement in opposition to the government, especially around this immigration ban and so forth. He went after us. And to say that he liberated Bonhoeffer, he's not a Bonhoeffer scholar. Bonhoeffer scholars have their problems, don't get me wrong. They have a problem. But I would at least give them the respect of having spent their lives studying the man. And they have a good picture of who he is and the context in which he's doing his work, which he doesn't. Yeah.
No, it's pretty gut-wrenching.
Yeah, he pulls him into the culture wars on the right. That's just what he does.
Exactly.
He makes him he makes him an avatar of U.S. culture wars on the right. That's it.
Yeah.